Hi, my name is Yael Simon, and I'm a sophomore studying neuroscience at Columbia University. Today, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Tal Zaks, an associate professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and the chief medical officer at Moderna. Welcome, Dr. Zaks. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Al. Great to be here.
So, before we speak about the vaccine and your role in its development, I'd love to hear about your story growing up in Israel, being a medical student at Ben Gurion University, and your personal path to where you are today.
Well, my story is a bit of a convoluted one, as it happens to be for physician scientists. I actually started as a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit, and the reason I was a nurse was because I was a medic before then in the IDF. And so I credit whatever I've done in life to an appreciation of teamwork that started by learning medicine from the other side of the patient's bed.
So, to kind of fast forward to today, can you elaborate a little bit on your particular role in Moderna's vaccine development?
Yeah, so for the past 6 years, up until I think the beginning of COVID, I was, as chief medical officer, responsible of our entire clinical pipeline. So everything that the company invented and discovered was put into drugs or vaccines, and then with the goal of putting it into patients. And a few really interesting things along the way, like personalized cancer vaccine, trying to figure out for each patient what are the mutations that we can get the immune system to recognize and make a bespoke vaccine just in time, just for that patient. And several other interesting applications that I won't go into. But because this technology can move so fast and is so versatile, we've been able as a biotech company to actually set a world record for how many new applications you can translate from the lab into the clinic in a relatively short amount of time. And so that takes us from 2015 to the beginning of 2020, the beginning of last year, when it was becoming clear that we have this new pandemic threat, initially isolated to China. A year ago, people weren't sure how big of a problem this was going to be in the US and in the Western world, but within weeks, it was becoming apparent that this is not contained. And so at that time, I shifted over my attention, and working with my colleagues at the executive team, we decided to take this on as a focus for the company, and I was asked to be the executive to lead it, given my background in drug development. And so I built the team, attracted the people, and actually got the team together to take what was an initial idea that the manufacturing team was able, within a matter of about 6 weeks or so, to put into production and get enough supplies to start a clinical trial, to actually take it all the way through clinical development, phase 1, then phase 2, and finally a pretty large phase 3 that read out this past November, and has now led to data that are supporting the use of a vaccine to prevent COVID-19 across the world.
Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say we really appreciate all the work you're doing. So, to take this on a more personal note, can you tell us a little bit about what the past year has been like for you? How have you managed to deal with the immense pressures that come with developing a world-changing vaccine?
Yeah, so it's a good question. To the degree that I had time to reflect on it, I can tell you it's been, for us, for me, for my team, a very challenging year, like for the rest of us. I think there are a couple of things that stand out for me as I think back on this effort. If you think from the standpoint of a drug developer, most of the drugs I've developed in my life are for patients. And so you have a mental model of who's the patient that is benefiting from your drug, especially in cancer, whether you've seen these patients in your career or you get to learn of those who are enrolled on clinical trials. When somebody has a response and their cancer goes away, there's a tremendous sense of success, and you can connect the dots to an individual. And that's extremely rewarding. Of course, that there are going to be thousands that come up behind that individual, in the future, that will benefit from that achievement. But vaccines tends to be a very impersonal development. If you think about it, typically we give vaccines and we develop vaccines in healthy people. And the vast majority of these people, we will never know whether they actually have benefited from it. We think that it's a public health benefit. We prevent transmission from occurring. And so, herd immunity, et cetera. There's no real good face of who is the individual that benefits. But this one was different. The COVID-19 vaccine for me and for the team was really a highly personal engagement, if you will, with the end result, in the sense that we see what's happening out there. It's our families, it's our friends, it's people we care about. It's affected our way of life. It's affected everybody's way of life. But it's very easy to actually be personally connected to this. And as I was developing this, you think about the people you love who are at risk. My mom, my daughter-in-law, who's a third-year internal medicine resident in one of the New York City hospitals. And she was on the front line of the COVID wards back from last spring. So it really became a very personal mission, and with it, a tremendous sense of gratitude and personal satisfaction when you see your loved ones in the end getting vaccinated and you yourself get vaccinated. So in that regard, I think this was different. Now, in terms of the people ask about the stress and the responsibility, I think I speak for our entire team, and I can tell you that there's no bigger stress than the one you feel internally, and there's no bigger motivation than the one that's driving you from within. The pressure that we all felt was not a function of the NIH, the politics, the money. The pressure was really a tremendous sense of responsibility, because those of us who've been close to this have seen firsthand the ability of this platform to actually generate a robust immune response. And so if you look back, we've been in the clinic now for 5 years with various other vaccines. For the 8 previous viruses against which we've tried to elicit neutralizing antibodies, we've been successful. And that's a pretty good track record, 8 out of 8. And here comes virus number 9. And the spike protein, the envelope, the thing that we're trying to educate the immune system against, is actually, from a scientific standpoint, quite straightforward. So we all had a good sense of optimism that we should be able to generate neutralizing antibodies. And based on what we know, basic virology and biology and medicine, that those neutralizing antibodies should indeed lead to protection of people. And so the sense of responsibility that we had was just as immense as the sense of excitement at the opportunity to make an impact here. And the two really went hand in hand. And I'll tell you that, it all came together first when we saw the initial results of the phase 1, and we saw how high the levels of the antibodies were. That was really reassuring. We saw that it was maintained in old people who are at greater risk for COVID-19, and that was an important data point. And so the data had reaffirmed our expectation. And then when we saw, of course, the final phase 3 results, that was a true moment of celebration, because you could see, okay, we understand enough about the science, about epidemiology, to be able to connect the dots and know that the work that this phenomenal team that has come together has put in for this past year is really about to pay off. And the one last thing I'd say is that we learned a new way of working in 2020. And I think for me and for the people that I've seen in the trenches, I hope some of those learnings are with us to stay. And by that, I mean, we've learned how to work remotely in a way that's been far more effective and efficient than anybody would have predicted. If you would have told me in 2019 that in 2020 you would be developing within a year a vaccine, you'd be doing it with a team, half of whom you recruited along the way, or more than half by now. And none of these new people whom you've recruited, you actually have met in person. I've shaken the hands of none of them. I've seen none of them in physical presence yet. Some of them have not yet been to Boston, even where our headquarters are. And yet we've been able to do this. We've done this in collaboration with the NIH, all of whom are very remote to where we are. And yet we've been so effective. And I think learning how to work remotely to such high effectiveness has really been an eye-opener. And I hope that level of productivity stays with us in the future. I miss, of course, getting in a room together with people and, joking and gossiping and having coffee together and all that other great stuff. but it's alongside a recognition that there are other ways to work effectively in collaboration as humans. And I think for me, that was really a bit of an unexpected silver lining in this process.
So, to kind of bring the story back to Israel, Israel has really struggled through spikes of COVID-19 cases. They've ordered multiple lockdowns, yet their vaccine rollout really has been the fastest in the world. So, from your perspective, what do you think contributed to Israel's challenges as well as their successes? And how can we potentially learn from their example?
So I'll say two things about Israel. First, I think they were quite prescient and erudite in the manner in which they evaluated the need and the potential for different vaccine platforms. I know I have been in contact with members of the Ministry of Health going back to the spring, and they had the clear foresight to understand what is needed and how to get about getting getting ready to have access to these vaccines. And as you can see in the news around us, that's not a trivial matter to navigate. In terms of the rollout itself, I think it's been an unbelievable success. And I credit that success, I think, to a mindset in the country as well as to infrastructure in the country. And that's where it's hard to replicate. As an ex-Israeli, if there ever is such a thing, so let's call it what it is, as also an Israeli in some part of my core, the country has at its basics a sense of community that, despite the political rhetoric and everything else, I think still is a connecting dots among everybody. And there is nothing that brings out that sense of community like a good crisis, right? So let no crisis go to waste, as we joke. And I think what you've seen here is that sense of community as well as infrastructure for preparedness in a country that's relatively small and that has a very good healthcare infrastructure and the ability to know, where individuals are in terms of their healthcare needs. That was all is being put together in a way that is really leading the path for other countries. So far, I haven't seen anybody come close to the efficiency of what the Israeli rollout has been able to muster. We're going through our own challenges in this country. I think it's unfair to compare because of the level of, if you will, on one hand, individualism, and on the other hand, fragmentation of our healthcare system. That's well known, that, as we can see around us these days, is becoming quite challenging to translate vaccine stockpiles into actual doses in arms. But even, say, European countries that are a little bit more akin to Israel in terms of their national healthcare infrastructure, I think, are struggling to replicate that. And I suspect at the core, it's that sense of commitment people have to each other and a preparedness infrastructure given what the country has been through.
So many people have spoken about why a strong bilateral US-Israel relationship is vital to both countries. So how have you seen the mutual benefits of that relationship vis-a-vis medicine and the sciences? Perhaps you know of some instances where the US has actually benefited from this strong partnership.
Well, at a personal level, the U.S. has had to put up with me, so I'll leave that to your determination. Um, I have seen a very sort of productive exchange of ideas and science throughout my career. Certainly in medicine, you see it probably even more in high tech. There is a sense of seeding with ideas and with abilities that exchange fosters. I've been part of looking at Israeli biotechs along the ways. I've seen the opportunities that the U.S. has brought to actually strengthen the capabilities that Israel has, and I've seen the scientific innovation and talent that Israel has contributed, I think, and continues to contribute to the U.S. fabric. And given the high level of alignment of the fundamental values, I think, between Israel and the United States, the sort of sanctity of life, the belief in science as a driving engine to a lot of what we do, our approach to, if you will, unleashing individual creativity through constructive capitalism, if I may call it that. I think the congruence is very high, and you've seen the benefits on both sides of the aisle.
So to kind of take the story back to the vaccine, because of the speed of development, some people are hesitant or nervous to receive the vaccine. So what would you say to those individuals to give them the confidence that the vaccine is both safe and effective?
What do the data tell us? So you've seen our data. We're 94.1% effective at preventing COVID disease. We prevented all cases at the time of severe disease, and that's a pretty good level of protection. Now, what's also interesting is our vaccine was developed in parallel to Pfizer's, or the one that was actually invented by a German company called BioNTech. And both of these vaccines use a similar scientific approach, but they were developed completely independently. They use their own manufacturing process. They have their own way of doing things. The scientific principle is the same, but everything else is different. They tested it on different people. Even the endpoints were slightly different. And what did they see in the end? 95% efficacy. So, there's one thing that teaches us in science to believe data. It's when you have replication. So we always look at one result and we say, well, maybe that wasn't inaccurate. Maybe it's a fluke. Maybe it just happenstance. But that's why we ask for replication. And here you've seen replication happening in parallel, a 30,000 subjects trial, a 40,000 subject trial, and they both gave you an efficacy number that is within 1%, 94.1% and 95% efficacy. That doesn't happen by chance. That is scientific truth manifest in replication of a grand experiment.
Well, thank you for that. I really hope the world was listening closely. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Zaks. We really appreciate you joining our summit.
Good luck, and thank you for having me.